January 14, 2020. The data massive file, shrouded in decades of secrecy, was finally pried open by a long-fought legal battle. What it revealed was not a distant foreign plot, but a calculated, domestic weapon aimed directly at the American mind. How much of what you read, what you watch, what you believed as unquestionable fact was carefully curated, paid for, and planted by the very agency tasked with protecting you from foreign threats? The truth is that the Central Intelligence Agency didn't just influence the news. For decades, they successfully ran it, turning the Fourth Estate into their most effective and invisible propaganda machine. The quiet click of a release order in 2020 finally brought names to the surface, but the machinery behind the curtain had been operating since before the 60s. The narrative of control begins to coalesce around the early 1960s, shortly after the Bay of Pigs humiliation when the agency was desperate to reassert dominance. Following that failure, Operation Mongoose roared to life, but its eyes soon turned inward, looking for levers of public influence. Then came the Whisper campaign. By March 1963, records show specific, targeted surveillance, telephone intercepts against syndicated columnists Robert Allen and Paul Scott. They weren't just being watched. Their private conversations were being transcribed, analyzed, and perhaps leveraged. The effort escalated into the vast domestic espionage project known as Operation Chaos, running right up until 1974. Think about that window. Through the height of the civil rights movement, the escalation in Vietnam, and through Watergate, the agency was actively monitoring its own citizens under the guise of national security. For years, whispers persisted about questionable activities, but it took the shock of exposure, specifically media coverage surrounding the Castro assassination plots, to force a reaction. In January 1975, a CIA memorandum surfaced concerning these very media liaisons. The pressure was mounting. That same year, the Church Committee began its grim excavation, unearthing operations like MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and the notorious Family Jewels report, which finally exposed the breadth of Operation Mockingbird. The official finding was staggering. They confirmed 50 reporters, mostly stringers paid per story, maintained secret relationships with the agency. But 50 was just the beginning of the paper trail. Later, investigative journalist Carl Bernstein, building on the committee's findings, documented the astonishing reach. He alleged that over 400 members of the American press, editors, writers, journalists, carried out assignments for the CIA. They were the agency's eyes and ears, disseminating what the intelligence community labeled black propaganda news, with an entirely fabricated, unidentified source, right into domestic U.S. media streams. Imagine the scale of this operation, utilizing the infrastructure of legacy mainframe computers from the 60s and 70s to manage thousands of contacts. The agency understood that journalists, academics, and editors are often not wealthy. They simply couldn't resist the temptation to make some extra money, and the CIA did not hesitate to exploit that vulnerability. The mechanism was subtle. They used official yet secret relationships. They had the means to influence front pages, to shape narratives on the evening news, and to ensure certain inconvenient truths, like the full context of failed foreign interventions, never saw the light of day. The sheer scope leaves a gaping hole in our understanding. While the Church Committee confirmed 50 paid reporters, the initial description of the scandal hinted at thousands of journalists and media outlets involved. What was the true roster? What specific high-stakes black propaganda missions were run through the New York Times or major television networks? These are the questions still buried in the archives. The agency often distinguished between propaganda types: white, where the source was identified; gray, where the source was obscured; and black, where the source was entirely fabricated by the CIA. Mockingbird specialized in black. They even reportedly used specialized rotor presses to print propaganda leaflets, making them subtly distinguishable from legitimate newsprint. One of the open, lingering mysteries involves specific wiretap transcripts related to columnist Paul Scott. Even after the agency claimed their search for these sensitive documents was reasonably calculated and adequate in 2020, the final fate and completeness of those records remain clouded. The investigation into these media ties continued decades later. In 2007, the Family Jewels report was finally delivered to the National Security Archive. Then in 2015, the CIA declassified memos written for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, providing glimpses into the early Cold War justifications for such domestic manipulation, but the institutional memory of the operation was tenacious. In 2023, years after the initial file releases, The sitting CIA director had to personally intervene in a long-forgotten matter concerning those very Paul Scott wiretaps, suggesting that even the most highly publicized declassifications leave crucial threads dangling in the dark. The system was designed for maximum operational security, weaving itself into the fabric of American information distribution. It relied on the public's faith in established institutions, a faith that the agency systematically corrupted from within. The system was not designed to inform, it was designed to control the consensus. And for decades it succeeded beyond measure. Chapter 3. Limes. The edifice of consensus, so carefully constructed with fabricated stories and planted narratives, began to shudder not from an external blast, but from the internal pressures of exposure. The system's vulnerability lay in its dependence on secrecy. Once the mechanism was revealed, once the reporters realized they were being used, or worse, actively complicit, the unified front began to fracture. The initial shockwaves came through the investigations of the mid-70s. The Church Committee hearings were televised, laying bare the uncomfortable truth that the guardians of national security were also the architects of domestic deception. This wasn't about intercepting Soviet transmissions, it was about shaping what Mrs. Liu across America thought about the anti-war movement or the viability of Third World socialist leaders. The immediate aftermath was a scramble for plausible deniability. The CIA publicly declared Operation Mockingbird terminated. Names were scrubbed, protocols were supposedly rewritten, and the leadership assured Congress and by extension the American public that such deep intrusions into domestic journalism would never happen again. Yet the very nature of intelligence work suggests that an effective methodology is rarely abandoned. It is merely rebranded and buried deeper. The true collapse was not the closure of a specific file, but the erosion of trust. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the relationship between the press and the intelligence community shifted from one of covert collaboration to overt, adversarial skepticism. Journalists who had once happily accepted off-the-record guidance from a knowledgeable source in Langley now viewed every anonymous tip with suspicion, searching for the hidden hand, the planted agenda. This new skepticism, however, was unevenly applied. While the national media began to treat the Pentagon and CIA with a new degree of scrutiny, the era of adversarial journalism, the fundamental architecture of information dissemination, remained vulnerable. The core methodology had simply evolved to meet new technological realities. If the 1960s and 70s were defined by manipulating print and broadcast newsrooms, the 1990s offered the Internet, a vast, chaotic new frontier where centralized control was infinitely harder, but targeted influence infinitely easier. The old guard of the CIA recognized this immediately. They didn't need to own the editors of the Washington Post anymore. They needed to seed the nascent online forums, the burgeoning digital publications, and the comment sections of tomorrow. The transition was subtle. Instead of paying reporters for front-page stories, the new strategy focused on funding think tanks and academic research grants. These bodies, often appearing entirely independent, would produce white papers laden with CIA-friendly interpretations of global events. These papers would then be cited by seemingly neutral journalists who, perhaps unknowingly, were merely amplifying a pre-packaged conclusion. The source was no longer a compromised journalist, it was a seemingly objective academic journal. The institutional response to the Church Committee's findings was less about purification and more about hardening the shell. They learned that broad operations like Mockingbird were too traceable. The new approach was hyper-compartmentalized, ensuring that no single operative knew the full scope of the media engagement. If one cell was burned, the larger structure remained intact, continuing the mission under different auspices: strategic communications, information operations, or foreign engagement initiatives. The 2001 attacks provided the perfect catalyst for the system to reassert itself with renewed vigor. In the context of the global war on terror, the argument for managed information became irresistible to many in power. The threat was existential, the justification absolute. Suddenly, questioning official narratives about WMDs in Iraq or the necessity of sweeping surveillance programs was framed not as responsible journalism, but as aiding the enemy. The pressure on the media in the early 2000s was immense. Journalists were actively embedded with military units, creating an intimacy that blurred the lines between observer and participant. When reporters are physically dependent on the military for their safety and access, The temptation to self-censor, to avoid running stories that might jeopardize future embeds, becomes overwhelming. This created a powerful, voluntary constraint, far more effective than the covert payments of the Mockingbird era. The final decisive blow to the old system of control was not the truth itself, but the splintering of the media landscape. By the time the internet had matured into social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the CIA no longer needed to own a few hundred journalists. They needed to influence the algorithms that determined what billions of people saw. The focus shifted from controlling the gatekeepers, editors, to influencing the distribution channels, platforms. This is the modern iteration of systemic manipulation, leveraging vast data troves, purchased or acquired through intelligence partnerships, to micro-target individuals with specific narratives designed to